When a poised and powerful black businesswoman was casually laughed at and dismissed by a smug airport agent in front of a line of strangers, no one expected what would happen next. They thought they could erase her dignity with a smirk and a seat change. But what they didn't know was that she wasn't just any passenger. She was the storm they never saw coming. And before the day was done, careers would crumble, systems would collapse, and justice would be served in silence. Stay until the end to see how one woman turned quiet humiliation into a reckoning that shook an entire industry. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story, it is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now, let's get into the story. The early morning glow filtered through the glass panes of Los Angeles International Airport, illuminating the bustling terminal with an ethereal, almost deceptive calm. Naomi Sinclair stood at the threshold of Gate 24, her figure a silhouette of poised elegance against the awakening chaos of travelers rushing for connecting flights, echoing announcements, and the soft drone of luggage wheels scraping polished floors. Her grip tightened around the handle of a rich mahogany suitcase, as if steadying herself against the familiar weight of displacement. She was no stranger to this scene. Over the years, Naomi had navigated countless airports across continents, each with its own undercurrent of power plays and silent judgments. Today, however, felt different. There was an edge to the air, a static that raised invisible hairs on her skin. Dressed impeccably in a tailored midnight blue coat and a silk scarf that bore the subtle shimmer of heritage, she looked every part the accomplished executive she was until she opened her mouth. The moment her smooth, softly accented voice asked the gate agent for boarding confirmation, something shifted. The woman behind the counter, Chloe Patterson, her nameplate revealed with corporate precision, let out a breathless chuckle, a sound not of amusement, but of something far colder. It was the kind of laugh that slides between politeness and malice, a scalpel disguised as a smile. Chloe's eyes, quick and assessing, flicked over Naomi's face, her skin, her deliberate grace. "That's quite the accent you have there," Chloe said, her tone light, but lined with unspoken condescension. She didn't wait for Naomi's reply. A subtle ripple passed through the nearby staff whispers, exchanged smirks, half hidden behind clipped gestures, as if a decision had already been made before Naomi had even stepped forward. "There's been a change in your seating." Chloe continued, her fingers clicking across the keyboard with feigned concern. "Looks like you've been reassigned to economy, seat 44E. Naomi felt her pulse slow, not from panic, but from a creeping, bone-deep realization. "I booked 2A, she said quietly, her tone composed, not rising to meet the sudden storm. Chloe's smile sharpened. Sometimes the system corrects itself. Maybe there was an error in the booking. Happens more often than you'd think. The words were wrapped in practiced customer service script, but the malice was clear, buried under the veneer of professionalism. Passengers in the line behind Naomi shifted, some craning their necks to watch others sighing in impatience. A few muttered about the delay, glancing at Naomi with the fleeting disdain reserved for those who dared to disrupt the smooth machinery of travel. She felt her hands grow cold, not with fear, with clarity. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't about a seat. It was about a decision made in the space of a glance, a calculation of worth drawn not from records or reservations, but from the color of her skin, the shape of her words. As Chloe turned to greet the next passenger, a man in cargo shorts, crumpled boarding pass in hand, whose approach was met with cheerful, unquestioning efficiency, Naomi's gaze remained fixed on her. In that moment, she realized something far more insidious than outright rejection. It wasn't loud. It wasn't crude. It was systematic, seamless. A faint, almost imperceptible shudder ran through Naomi's chest, a mixture of quiet rage and piercing understanding. She stood taller, the weight of her own history, and every dismissal, every sidelong glance she'd ever endured, pressing into her spine like a shield. Her voice, when it came, was low and clear. "Is there a supervisor I can speak to?" Chloe's eyes narrowed, her mouth tightening at the edges. She tapped her earpiece, radioing someone with the exaggerated patience of a retail worker dealing with a perceived problem. Naomi's request was met with delay, with orchestrated indifference, as if the simple act of acknowledging her complaint was an inconvenience too heavy to bear. The minutes dragged. The line behind her grew restless. It wasn't until a junior staff member approached Lucas, his name whispered between the badges, that Naomi caught a flicker of something resembling guilt in his expression. His voice was barely above a whisper, but Naomi caught every word. "They don't want you in first class. Said it doesn't fit the brand image. Better to have you somewhere less visible." For a moment, Naomi's breath caught her mind processing the quiet confession. But her face betrayed nothing. Not yet. She offered a nod of acknowledgement, her silence slicing sharper than any protest. It was a silence that wasn't born from submission, but from calculation, a gathering storm that no one at this terminal with their hushed chuckles and forced smiles seemed to sense coming. As she stood there, waiting, Naomi's phone buzzed softly in her pocket. She glanced at it, a prearranged signal from her executive assistant. A single word illuminated the screen: "Ready." The corner of her mouth twitched imperceptibly, not into a smile, but into a thin line of resolve. She knew that what was unfolding wasn't just personal humiliation. It was a mirror, reflecting the quiet rot at the core of polished corporate facades, and as the terminal around her hummed with the oblivious rhythms of daily travel, as announcements called for boarding groups, and the staff behind the counter dismissed her presence as a nuisance best ignored, Naomi felt the air shift. It was subtle, a ripple before the wave, but it was there. The storm had begun, not with shouts or accusations, but with a glance, a smirk, and the underestimation of a woman who understood far too well how the world tried to erase her, quietly, efficiently, and with a smile. By the time her name was called an afterthought, a final check of the manifest Naomi had already decided. There would be no confrontation. Not here, not now. But the reckoning had begun, and the cost of this morning's casual cruelty would be paid in full. The storm, once set in motion, would not be silenced. Not this time. Naomi Sinclair sat rigidly in a sleek molded plastic chair near the far wall of Gate 24. The overhead speakers droned with the rhythm of routine announcements, calling for final boarding of flights bound for places far removed from the sterile corridors of LAX. Her suitcase rested neatly by her feet, its gleaming leather surface a quiet testament to her status, a status which in this space had been dismissed as easily as an errant passenger on standby. Yet it wasn't the demotion from first class to economy that filled her veins with a slow-burning resolve. It was the web of whispered warnings and the practiced silence that encased the scene. She observed Chloe Patterson as she continued her gate duties, her plastic smile stretching thin beneath the weight of her own biases. Naomi noticed the subtle exchanges, furtive glances between staff, the slight shuffle of feet when passengers muttered about the problem at the counter. Even those who might have said something, who might have challenged the gate agent's curt demeanor, chose instead to glance away their faces, betraying discomfort. Silence was a comfortable cocoon here, a barrier against the discomfort of acknowledging wrongs. A flight attendant named Grace moved past her eyes, flickering briefly to Naomi before darting away. She was young, her posture slightly tense, her pace quickening as though distance from the scene could shield her from its implications. Naomi's gaze tracked her, noting how even among those who recognized the injustice, the pull of silent compliance was too strong. Grace's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the lapel of her uniform, a gesture so small it might have gone unnoticed. But Naomi saw it. She saw it all. Lucas, the junior staffer, who had hesitated earlier, returned to the counter, his voice low as he spoke to Chloe. Naomi couldn't hear the words, but she read the tension in his posture, the slight furrow of his brow. His body language screamed reluctance, yet his mouth moved in quick-clipped sentences, delivering the excuses that had been drilled into him. Just following protocol, she imagined him saying, "That's what they told me to do." Chloe's response was a barely perceptible shake of her head lips, tight with the thin smile of someone who had already decided her role in the unfolding drama. Her voice rose just slightly, a sweet saccharine lilt covering the barbs of dismissal. "Just let it go, Lucas. It's not worth it." Naomi felt the tension knot tighter in her chest. It wasn't just Chloe. It was the entire chain of whispered warnings and tacit nods, the silent complicity that allowed this system to function with such ruthless efficiency. Even as she sat in plain view, her presence a quiet protest against the treatment she'd endured, the machinery of compliance ground on without pause. Passengers avoided her gaze. Attendants adjusted their scarves and badges, and the line of travelers shuffled forward, eager to escape the discomfort of confrontation. A woman seated across the aisle, a middle-aged traveler with sharp eyes and a designer bag at her feet, watched Naomi for a long moment before looking away. Her lips pressed into a thin line, a silent acknowledgement of something unjust, but her attention snapped back to her phone screen with a quickness that reeked of self-preservation. It wasn't malice, Naomi realized. It was fear. Fear of being entangled in a situation that might jeopardize one's own comfort, one's own illusion of safety. The security officers stationed near the terminal's glass entrance watched with impassive faces, their hands resting lightly on their belts. They were not called to action, not because there was no cause, but because the drama unfolding was wrapped in the silent compliance that never reached the threshold of overt confrontation. Their presence was a visual deterrent, a reminder that power could be summoned with a glance, with a whisper, and that silence, when institutionalized, was as potent as any order. Naomi's phone vibrated again. A discreet message appeared on the locked screen. Its contents, a silent signal from her assistant back in the towering office she commanded across continents. The message was brief-coded, but its meaning, clear preparations were advancing. She breathed in slowly, letting the air settle deep in her lungs. This wasn't the time to act. Not yet. She was gathering witnesses' patterns evidence. The storm she would unleash would not be born from rage, but from precision, from the slow and meticulous weaving of truth into a weapon. Grace, the young flight attendant, hesitated as she passed by again. Her steps faltered, and for a moment, She seemed to consider stopping to say something, to offer even the smallest token of acknowledgement. But her courage withered under the weight of professional decorum and unspoken rules. She ducked her head, quickening her pace, her silence louder than any spoken word. Naomi's eyes followed her briefly, then shifted back to Chloe, who now conversed with a man in a sharp business suit, his economy ticket clutched haphazardly, his tone dripping with entitlement. Chloe laughed softly, too softly, and with a few quick keystrokes reassigned his seat to a prime location. Naomi noted every detail, the casual override, the preferential treatment, and filed it away like a lawyer preparing an airtight case. The gate buzzed with final boarding announcements, voices rising in artificial cheer as passengers gathered their belongings and made their way toward the jet bridge. Naomi remained seated, her posture regal and unyielding her presence, an anchor amidst the tide of indifference. Even as the line dwindled and the gate agents prepared to close the doors, she did not move. She would not be erased so easily. Lucas returned to the counter. His shoulders slumped, his face pale beneath the fluorescent lights. He glanced once at Naomi, guilt bleeding into his features, but said nothing. His silence was a confession, unspoken, yet deafening in its weight. Naomi met his gaze evenly, a silent exchange that spoke volumes. She didn't need his words. She had seen enough. As the last passengers disappeared down the jet bridge and the terminal quieted into a dull hum, Naomi slowly stood, gathering her coat with a deliberate grace. She had let them believe they'd won this encounter. Let them think she'd been placated, dismissed, relegated to the background. But they had miscalculated. They had mistaken silence for submission, underestimating the quiet power that moved beneath the surface. Naomi's steps were measured as she approached the counter one final time. Chloe looked up, her smile brittle, her voice ready to deliver one last platitude. But Naomi spoke first, her voice low, rich with the promise of something far more potent than confrontation. "I hope you're ready," she said softly, "because this story doesn't end at Gate 24. And with that, she turned, walking away from the terminal that had just hours before tried to erase her presence. The whispered warnings and silent compliance that had conspired against her would soon crumble beneath the weight of their own complicity. They just didn't know it yet. The tension beneath the polished surface of the airport wasn't merely a ripple, it was a fracture waiting to split. By the time Naomi Sinclair's silhouette had disappeared from Gate 24, a quiet tremor had already begun its silent, irreversible spread. From a distance, the terminal continued its orchestrated dance of travel, the rhythmic buzz of overhead announcements, the shuffle of carry-ons across polished floors, the polite murmur of conversations. But closer behind the counters, behind the stoic uniforms, behind the digital check-ins, there was a distinct shift in atmosphere, the kind of shift that signaled not just an incident, but the birth of reckoning. Lucas, the junior staffer, who had tried, however weakly, to voice his discomfort, now found himself spiraling inward. He returned to his small workstation behind the counter, his hands trembling as they skimmed through booking entries and flight manifests. His mind, however, wasn't focused on the tasks in front of him. It was caught in a loop of Naomi's quiet resilience, her composed departure, and the heavy realization of what had been set into motion. The systems Lucas once trusted as stable and fair had shown their fractures. His training hadn't prepared him for this moment, for the weight of complicity that now pressed against his chest like a stone. Elsewhere in the terminal, Chloe Patterson's veneer of professionalism began to crumble at its edges. After Naomi's departure, she attempted to resume her duties with mechanical precision, but her mind replayed the encounter in fragments: Naomi's steady voice, her unreadable gaze, the echo of her parting words. Each click of her keyboard now felt more fragile. Each smile offered to passengers more strained. She'd seen situations before, where bias subtle as breath went unchecked. But never had she felt it bite back so swiftly. Her laughter, her dismissive tones, her willingness to appease certain passengers while dismissing others, each was now a splinter working its way under her skin. Grace, the young flight attendant, stood by the far end of the terminal, her hands folded tightly before her. The tremor of regret coursed through her like an aftershock. She had seen it all and done nothing. She had played her part in the silent compliance, the pretense of professionalism. Now that silence felt suffocating. A pang of guilt gnawed at her more profound than she'd anticipated. Her thoughts wandered to her first day at the airline, her naive excitement, the pride of wearing the uniform. How easily she had let that pride become a shield, a mask to cover her own discomfort in the face of injustice. Naomi's dignity had shattered that illusion. Meanwhile, in the hushed corners of the operations office, the shift supervisor, a wiry man named Dennis Marks, watched the screens with growing unease. The incident had not been reported formally, but whispers were already creeping along the lines of communication. Staff radios crackled with low-voiced exchanges. Security personnel exchanged glances. The digital log showed seat reassignments and override codes, but no one had yet flagged it as a breach of protocol. Not officially. But Dennis felt the weight of it settling on his shoulders. He knew this wasn't just a disgruntled passenger causing a scene. The threads were unraveling, and the knots of the system were tightening in ways he hadn't anticipated. Naomi, meanwhile, had reached the executive lounge not as a guest, but as an observer. She remained quiet, her phone in hand, scrolling through the private channels of her network. Messages flickered across the screen, legal advisors pinging in from 3 time zones, logistical experts preparing statements, travel consortia initiating preliminary freezes on joint operations with the airline. Each message was a calculated move, a silent stone placed on a chessboard where every piece had been underestimated. Naomi's face was impassive, but her thoughts were cutting through the terminal's false calm like a scalpel. As the minutes passed, the airport's superficial order began to falter. The terminal screens glitched briefly, causing passenger manifests to flash inconsistently. The queue at the check-in counter lengthened as Chloe fumbled through manual reassignments for flights she had once controlled with ease. Lucas overheard snippets of conversations from supervisors, murmured fears about system errors, about oversight failures. Chloe's hands trembled visibly as she tried to maintain composure, but the weight of accumulated missteps bore down on her. She could feel Naomi's shadow in every crack of the system, a presence she couldn't erase or dismiss. Grace lingered near the jet bridge, stealing glances at the gate agents, as if waiting for some sign that someone would speak up, someone would address what had happened. But no one did. The silence deepened, thickening the air around her. It was then she understood something Naomi had known from the start. The real power of injustice wasn't in the loud public acts of exclusion. It was in the quiet, almost invisible agreements, those moments where people looked away, where policies were written to protect silence over truth. In the staff break room, Dennis paced his phone, pressed to his ear. He was trying to reach his regional manager, but the line kept cutting out. Messages went unanswered. Reports of unusual delays were beginning to surface. Naomi's influence, though unseen, was now palpable. It wasn't just her company's legal threats or the looming risk of bad press. It was the slow, insidious erosion of confidence. Chloe, Lucas, Grace, all of them felt it a crack beneath the surface of their carefully maintained order. The silence that had once protected them was now their undoing. Naomi's departure wasn't a retreat. It was an earthquake. One whose tremors were now rippling outward, destabilizing not just the gate, not just the terminal, but the entire foundation upon which these silent injustices were built. And as the cracks widened, the question hanging in the air wasn't whether the system would break. It was how soon and at what cost the reckoning would come. As the day's light stretched longer across the walls of Denver International Airport, the fracture beneath its polished surface deepened. By mid-afternoon, the systems that had once hummed with precision were now trembling under the weight of hidden disruptions. Emails queued in executive inboxes, urgent messages from regional offices stacked unanswered, and beneath it all, a growing realization that the quiet figure they'd dismissed had never truly left the terminal. Naomi Sinclair had merely shifted her strategy. Behind the sterile walls of her private office in Denver's financial district, Naomi's legal team coordinated with eerie calm. Their approach was neither loud nor reactionary. Instead, it unfolded with the same quiet force she had shown at the terminal, a steady, deliberate exercise of power. Calls were made to revoke vendor contracts linked to the airline meetings were quietly canceled, and entire blocks of premium reservations were frozen with one-line directives. No legal statements were issued, no press releases drafted. The strategy wasn't about public condemnation. It was about systemic accountability executed with the precision of a scalpel. At the airport, Chloe Patterson found herself summoned to a hastily arranged meeting in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the runways. She entered with a notebook clutched to her chest, her nerves frayed. Dennis Marks, the shift supervisor, sat across from her, his face drawn and pale. Behind him, two men in dark suits, both from the airline's corporate compliance division, listened in silence. "We need to understand what happened," one of them said, his tone controlled but clipped. "The reassignment, the security intervention, the systemic overrides. Was there an error?" Chloe's voice wavered as she began recounting the events: Naomi's approach, her boarding pass, the subtle smirks, the whispered jokes. As she spoke, fragments of complicity surfaced like broken glass. The silent compliance, the decisions made in whispers, the small betrayals of integrity. But for the first time, Chloe's recounting wasn't defensive. It was edged with a quiet regret that twisted her words into something vulnerable. "We were just following what we thought was standard," she murmured, "but we didn't think about what it meant." Outside the meeting room, Grace lingered by the terminal service corridor, her thoughts heavy with reflection. She watched families gather at the gates, children clinging to stuffed animals, business travelers tapping anxiously at phones. And amidst this mundane scene, the weight of her silence grew heavier. She had not spoken up. She had chosen comfort over courage. But the look on Naomi's face, composed, unflinching, haunted her. It was a reminder that silence was its own kind of complicity, and that redemption, if possible, would demand more than quiet regret. Back in the operations center, Lucas hovered over a console, his heart pounding, as he traced the escalating system failures. Vendor codes were returning errors, boarding queues, reassigning without approval, and priority systems flagged for internal review. He recognized Naomi's hand in these silent disruptions, not as vengeance, but as an assertion of control. His hands trembled as he realized how easily a single underestimated individual could shift the balance of an entire system. By evening, the airport's executive wing was a flurry of activity. Naomi's quiet withdrawal had rippled into a full-blown crisis. Compliance officers whispered behind closed doors, their voices tight with anxiety. Rumors circulated about Naomi's affiliations, about her influence in elite travel networks, and her company's connections to international logistics partners. The realization dawned with chilling clarity. She wasn't just a passenger. She was a cornerstone client whose quiet decisions could collapse entire pillars of their operations. But amidst this reckoning, there was resilience, though not where most expected it. Grace, the young flight attendant, requested an impromptu meeting with her supervisor. She spoke quietly, but with newfound resolve. "I need to report something," she said. She recounted the timeline, the whispered warnings, the smirks behind desks, the way silence had smothered fairness. It wasn't an act of bravery born of innocence. It was a choice made in the aftermath of realization. Her report wasn't comprehensive, but it was a crack in the wall of complicity. Chloe, too, found her own form of resilience. Alone in the break room after her debrief, she sat staring at her reflection in a scratched mirror. The weight of her actions pressed against her chest, but for the first time she let it settle rather than push it away. She opened her phone and drafted an email. Not to HR, not to her supervisor, but to Naomi. She apologized. Not in flowery language or rehearsed platitudes, but in raw, unvarnished truth. "I saw what we did, and I didn't stop it," she wrote. "I didn't speak because it was easier to stay silent. I'm sorry." Lucas, overwhelmed by his own role in the spiraling events, didn't send an apology. Instead, he submitted a formal report to corporate outlining the system overrides the procedural lapses and the silent approvals that had enabled the discrimination. It was a dry document, factual and precise, but it was his attempt to replace silence with accountability. Naomi, for her part, watched these tremors from a quiet corner office as dusk painted Denver's skyline in streaks of gold and lavender. She wasn't waiting for apologies. She didn't need public contrition. Her focus remained on the broader picture, a restructuring of relationships, a recalibration of power, a redefinition of resilience. This wasn't just about her own experience. It was about unmasking a culture that thrived on silence. The reckoning, as it unfolded, wasn't a spectacle. It was a quiet dismantling, a withdrawal of trust, a reallocation of influence. For Naomi, it wasn't an act of vengeance. It was an assertion of dignity, an insistence that resilience wasn't about weathering injustice, it was about transforming it. And as the airport's polished corridors filled with nervous whispers and silent reckonings, Naomi remained composed. Because for her, the real victory was never in the reaction. It was in the quiet resilience of action that rewrote the rules entirely. Naomi Sinclair's car moved smoothly through the quiet streets of Denver, the city's skyline slowly fading into the night behind her. The lights of the towering buildings glimmered against the deep blue sky, a sharp contrast to the turmoil that had brewed beneath them just hours before. She sat silently, her gaze fixed on the path ahead, but her mind traced the lines of what had unfolded. It wasn't just the collapse of an ill-fated system at the airport. It was the dawning of a realization, a quiet reclamation of control that had always been hers to wield. The events of the day were not about revenge or public spectacle. They were about truth. A truth long ignored, long buried beneath polished veneers and practiced smiles. Naomi's actions were deliberate, not because she sought chaos, but because she recognized the power of measured resolve. She had allowed the system to expose itself to unravel under its own weight. And now, as the city exhaled under the cover of night, she began to consider what came next. In her Denver office, the quiet buzz of incoming emails and notifications had slowed to a near halt. The legal teams had already filed the necessary withdrawals. The financial departments had closed out accounts, and the system disruptions she'd initiated earlier in the day had cascaded into quiet systemic recalibrations. Contracts were being reevaluated, and calls for reparation were beginning to echo across corporate channels. But for Naomi, these were merely formalities. She was already thinking beyond the immediate aftermath. The next chapter was not about returning to the old structures or issuing statements that placated the public's hunger for resolution. Naomi understood the futility of apologies without accountability of reassurances made hollow by inaction. She envisioned something more profound, a transformation not just within her own organization, but across the broader network of partnership stakeholders and communities she touched. She wasn't interested in performative gestures. She wanted change that was structural, irreversible, and infused with integrity. The message she sent that evening was simple but unmistakable. It wasn't addressed to the press, nor was it posted on social media for public consumption. It was a private communication to her board of directors, her core leadership team, and the key partners who had weathered storms alongside her. Our responsibility, it began, is to build systems where dignity is the foundation, not a privilege. Where silence is not a strategy, but action is. Where every decision reflects the values we claim to uphold. Effective immediately, all future partnerships will be reevaluated against this standard. Any that fall short will be terminated. No exceptions. The weight of those words resonated far beyond the walls of her office. They marked a shift not only in policy, but in philosophy, a declaration that Naomi was no longer content to operate within a flawed system. She was prepared to build a new one that could not be so easily undone by bias disguised as bureaucracy, by prejudice wrapped in professionalism. The following week, Naomi convened a private summit at a discreet retreat center tucked into the mountains outside Boulder. She gathered her closest advisors, community leaders, and a select few from organizations that had proven their commitment to equity and justice. It wasn't a press event, and there were no staged photo ops. Instead, it was a space for honest conversation, for confronting uncomfortable truths, and for envisioning a future not dictated by old norms, but shaped by new inclusive realities. As they sat around the large oak table, the conversations were raw and unfiltered. Stories were shared, some of failure, some of resilience. Plans were drafted not to simply repair what had been broken, but to replace it entirely. Naomi listened, contributed, and then as the evening deepened, she spoke. Her voice was steady, but it carried a depth that silenced the room. The systems we build, she said, must be strong enough to withstand bias, but flexible enough to correct it. They must be transparent, accountable, and built with empathy at their core. We're not here to patch the old. We're here to create the new. In the quiet that followed, something shifted. It wasn't just the resolve of one woman, but the awakening of a collective understanding that change, real change, doesn't begin with policies or penalties. It begins with the courage to reimagine the world as it should be, and the resolve to make it real. As Naomi looked around the room, at faces reflecting determination, hope, and hard-won wisdom, she felt something deeper than satisfaction. She felt a renewed purpose. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy. It would demand more moments of silence, more difficult decisions, and more unwavering commitment. But she was ready. The beginning of a new chapter wasn't marked by announcements or headlines. It was marked by a quiet gathering of resolve, the first steps toward dismantling an old narrative and replacing it with one written by dignity, equity, and a relentless pursuit of justice. Naomi Sinclair knew that her story was no longer just her own. It was the story of everyone willing to stand with her and of the world they were determined to build. Naomi Sinclair's journey wasn't merely a tale of resistance. It was a masterclass in resilience, a testament to the quiet yet indomitable power of integrity. What began with a moment of silent dismissal at an airport counter in Denver, unfolded into a symphony of deliberate actions that dismantled a web of complacency and prejudice. Naomi, a woman of unshakable poise and vision, did not raise her voice in anger. Instead, she wielded her authority with precision, turning the very system that sought to diminish her into a reflection of its own failings. Through her calm, calculated withdrawal of Coleman Global's partnerships and a strategic reevaluation of alliances, she illustrated that real power often lies not in confrontation, but in quiet, uncompromising resolve. The narrative was not one of revenge, but of justice, a reclamation of dignity that transcended individual affronts and reverberated through corporate corridors and community halls. Naomi's choice to confront the silent biases and systemic failures, not with fury, but with structured and impactful action, forced not just an organization, but an entire ecosystem to reckon with its failings. She proved that silence, when chosen wisely, can echo louder than any shout. It was a silence that demanded attention, that disrupted the comfortable rhythms of those complicit in the status quo. This story is a mirror for our own lives. The lesson Naomi's experience imparts is clear and profound. True change begins with the refusal to accept the unacceptable, with the courage to stand steady in the face of systemic wrongs. It's about understanding that while the world may dismiss you through quiet prejudice or overt discrimination, your worth and your voice remain intact. Naomi's strategy of walking away from toxic partnerships while simultaneously laying the groundwork for equitable systems offers a blueprint for anyone feeling powerless in the face of injustice. Whether in corporate boardrooms, public institutions, or personal relationships, the principle stands: integrity combined with strategic action can shift even the most entrenched dynamics. For each of us, the story's lesson invites introspection and boldness. It challenges us to identify where we might be silently complicit in systems that exclude or demean others. It urges us to step into moments where our quiet, decisive actions can rewrite narratives not through conflict, but through clarity and unwavering commitment to what is just.